In late 1944, the Pacific balance had shifted toward a sustained approach against the Japanese home islands. United States forces had secured the Marianas, bringing B-29 bases within range of Honshu, and enabling a strategic bombing campaign that began in November. Submarine warfare cut shipping routes from the Netherlands, East Indies, and the South China Sea. Tanker losses reduced Japan's fuel flow and constrained fleet operations. Land campaigns across New Guinea, the Central Pacific, and the Philippines narrowed Japanese options to coastal defense, night movement, and a reliance on locally stockpiled munitions. In this setting, Okinawa, the largest island of the Ryukyus, gained central relevance. Its airfields lay roughly 540 kilometers from Kyushu and close to traffic lanes skirting the East China Sea. Control of these airfields promised fighter cover for BA-29s and staging for heavier escort and reconnaissance. It also offered a test of the defensive capacity of the Japanese Army, Navy, and air components nearest to the home islands, before any decision to launch Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Kyushu and Honshu. Political and strategic calculations in Tokyo and Washington converged on the island for different reasons. The Imperial General Headquarters sought to preserve a defensive perimeter that would impose high costs on an attacker and buy time for training aircraft production, and consolidation on Kyushu. The Navy, after heavy losses in carrier air groups and fuel shortages, reoriented toward shore-based aviation and special attack units intended to strike Allied fleets from Kyushu and Formosa. The Army's 32nd Army on Okinawa, created in 1944, absorbed infantry divisions, mixed brigades, naval-based troops, and construction units into a composite force positioned to meet an amphibious landing. Tokyo's expectation was that the fighting would occur under the enemy's air and naval superiority. The counterweight would be terrain, fortifications, and a measured commitment of aircraft in waves from surrounding airfields. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs evaluated multiple routes to close the war: blockade, bombardment, and invasion. The Luzon operation underway in early 1945 would sever what remained of Japanese shipping in the Philippines. Iwo Jima, invaded in February, was assessed as a necessary forward base for fighter escorts and emergency B-29 recoveries. Okinawa followed logically as a base complex to project air power against Kyushu and to support a maritime quarantine of the home islands. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, built around Task Force 58's fast carriers, would cover the landings. Vice Admiral Richmond Turner would command the amphibious force. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. would command the U.S. 10th Army ashore. That army combined the 24th Corps with the 3rd Amphibious Corps. 24th Corps included the 7th, 27th, 77th, and 96th Infantry Divisions. 3rd Amphibious Corps fielded the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, while the 2nd Marine Division remained afloat as reserve. Initial assault strength and immediate follow-on brought the ground force to well over 150,000, with naval and service elements increasing total personnel committed in the operation area to several 100,000. The fleet assembled more than 1,300 vessels, including carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and support ships configured for sustained fire support and logistics. Intelligence on both sides reflected the constraints of distance, deception, and changing doctrine. U.S. planners possessed aerial photography of Okinawa's beaches, ridgelines, and airfields at Kadena and Yantan, plus hydrographic surveys conducted by underwater demolition teams and earlier reconnaissance. SIGINT monitored radio activity in the Ryukyus and Kyushu, but could not fully quantify the number of aircraft dispersed on secondary fields. Estimates of Japanese ground strength on Okinawa ranged from roughly 60,000 to over 80,000, with additional naval personnel and labor units. Commanders anticipated heavy beach resistance patterned on Saipan or Peleliu, where immediate counterattacks had tested landing waves. Japanese doctrine on the island, however, evolved toward defense in depth. The 32nd Army, under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, with Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, and operations planning, directed by Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, prepared to concede the beaches and concentrate on a set of fortified positions anchored on the Shuri heights in the south. Extensive cave systems, reverse slope emplacements, interlocking fields of fire, and concealed artillery intended to slow and wear down advancing formations, rather than attempt early decisive counterblows. Civilian conditions shaped both planning and anticipated outcomes. Pre-war population on Okinawa exceeded 400,000, including a significant proportion engaged in agriculture and fishing. Evacuations to Kyushu in 1944 removed tens of thousands, but many residents remained in townships and farmsteads near key road networks. Japanese authorities organized student nurse units in local formations such as Boitai for labor and auxiliary defense roles. These groups increased manpower available for positions and logistics, but also tied civilian life more closely to military installations. U.S. psychological warfare teams prepared leaflets and loudspeaker protocols with instructions for civilians during landings, while medical units and civil affairs officers compiled plans for field hospitals, food distribution, and public health to manage dislocation once the front crossed populated districts. Material factors set the tempo before any shot was fired. The U.S. Naval Force stockpiled large quantities of naval gun ammunition calibrated for cave reduction, along with rockets and mortars for close support. Carrier air groups reconfigured loads for suppression of airfields and anti-shipping strikes north toward Kyushu. Logistics planners arranged a floating base of repair ships, hospital ships, and oilers to keep the fleet on station through the spring. The Japanese response, acknowledging limited capacity for sustained fleet action, concentrated aircraft on Kyushu and Formosa, with the intent to launch successive mass special attack sorties, later designated Kikusui, once the invasion began. Coordination between Army and Navy air commands, often a difficulty in earlier campaigns, received attention in orders that synchronized airfields and target priorities. Yet, fuel scarcity and training limits meant sortie numbers would fluctuate with weather and attrition. Terrain and climate provided fixed parameters. Northern Okinawa offered rolling hills and cultivated ground traversed by limited roadways. Central bottlenecks funneled movement toward the southern ridges, where the Shuri defensive complex occupied high ground, with good observation over approaches from the west. Limestone geology favored dugouts that could withstand bombardment if properly sited. Early spring weather brought variable visibility and rain that would complicate resupply and evacuation on unimproved roads. Hydrographic data suggested usable beaches on the western coast near Hagushi, with reef shelves that could challenge landing craft but not preclude them at low tide with careful timing. Public sentiment and expectations diverged across societies. In the United States, casualty reports from Iwo Jima in March 1945 highlighted the costs of volcanic terrain and determined defense. Okinawa was briefed as a larger, more complex operation. Navy crews prepared for air attack in proximity to the home islands. In Japan, official communications emphasized the defense of the gateway to Kyushu and the role of Okinawa as a shield. Civilian mobilization and exhortations to perseverance coexisted with practical measures such as rationing and shelter preparation. Within both militaries, staff assessments anticipated protracted fighting. The U.S. side expected to secure airfields quickly, but forecast weeks of inland operations. The Japanese side planned to absorb the initial blow intact and draw the battle into fortified lines where artillery, mortars, machine guns, and mines could exact steady losses. By late March 1945, the preconditions for Operation Iceberg were in place. The fleet concentrated at forward anchorages with replenishment groups sequenced for continuous support. Transports loaded assault waves and vehicles according to a landing schedule designed to seize airfields and expand laterally before pivoting south. Under caves and earthen revetments, Japanese units finalized ammunition stocks, range cards, and alternate positions, leaving false works and limited beach forces to signal a conventional defense, while the main body waited behind the first ridges. Both sides prepared to test their assumptions with forces sized for decisive outcomes in an area smaller than many earlier battlefields, yet positioned to influence decisions about the war's final months. In late March 1945, the vast Allied armada assembled off Okinawa's western coast. The preliminary phase of Operation Iceberg began with days of air and naval bombardment intended to isolate the island and destroy known defenses. Task Force 58's carrier aircraft struck airfields across the Ryukyus, Formosa, and Kyushu, while surface vessels shelled shore positions and conducted night illumination fire to disrupt any movement. The objective was to neutralize aircraft that could threaten the landings and to locate coastal artillery before the first wave approached the beaches. Between 23rd and 31st March, over 3,000 sorties targeted suspected installations. Yet the absence of a visible Japanese counteraction puzzled many observers. Reconnaissance reported little return fire, few aircraft in the air, and few troop movements. Some commanders speculated that the enemy's strength had been overstated. Others suspected concealment. On 26 March, preliminary landings seized the Kurama Islands, about 25 kilometers west of Okinawa. The capture of this small archipelago provided anchorages for repair and refueling vessels, anti-submarine screens, and hospitals. Resistance there was limited but determined, with Japanese garrisons conducting suicidal charges after heavy bombardment. Mine clearance began immediately, clearing approaches for transport convoys. The occupation of Kurama also revealed stockpiles of explosive-laden boats and suicide craft intended for later use against anchored fleets, confirming Allied expectations that Okinawa's defense included unconventional naval tactics. As the amphibious fleet maneuvered into position for the main landings, both American and Japanese command systems faced the onset of simultaneous pressures. Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet comprised more than 50 carriers, 16 battleships, and over 200 escort and supply vessels. Coordination between naval fire support and troop landings required continuous communications, vulnerable to radio interference and the dense smoke of bombardment. On Okinawa itself, General Ushijima's headquarters at Shuri maintained strict radio silence, relying on landlines and runners to preserve deception. Observers concealed in coastal areas relayed information by visual signals or coded telephone reports, ensuring the command knew every development without betraying positions. At dawn, on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, the first assault waves began landing along a 16-kilometer front on the Higuchi beaches. The operation unfolded with precision. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions took the northern sectors, while the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions landed to the south. Naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers pounded the shoreline, while rocket ships saturated inland areas. Expectations ran high for fierce resistance, yet the initial advance encountered only sporadic fire and scattered obstacles. Within hours, American units had secured both Kadena and Yantan airfields virtually intact. Bulldozers expanded runways for immediate fighter operations, and logistics crews began unloading supplies at record pace. The absence of major opposition on the beaches created both relief and unease. Commanders feared a trap. Inland patrols advanced several kilometers with little resistance, capturing villages and encountering abandoned trenches, mines, and decoy positions. Intelligence reports suggested the main Japanese forces had withdrawn to the south, centered around the Shuri line, a system of fortified ridges running across the island's waist. To confirm this, reconnaissance aircraft and forward observers extended searches toward the southern hills, noting defensive works and occasional mortar fire. It became clear that the Japanese had declined to contest the beaches, preserving manpower for positional defense. For the civilians caught in the invasion zone, the landings produced immediate displacement. Thousands fled southward, seeking shelter in caves or among family holdings beyond the combat line. Others remained near their homes, uncertain of what to expect. U.S. psychological warfare units broadcast announcements promising humane treatment for surrendering civilians and directing them toward collection points. Field hospitals prepared to handle both military and civilian casualties. Yet the collapse of local administration and the movement of armies soon made such organization fragmentary. By April 3rd, the 10th Army had established a firm lodgment. Supply dumps stretched inland from the beaches, naval engineers repaired docks at Naha, and constructed piers for heavy equipment, and command posts coordinated the next phase, securing the northern two-thirds of the island before turning south toward the main defenses. 3rd Amphibious Corps advanced northward against limited resistance. The Marines moved through Motobu Peninsula, encountering scattered defenders and irregular counterfire. In contrast, 24th Corps, facing south, met increasing opposition as it approached the first outlying positions of the Shuri system. For the defenders, the delay had served its purpose. The 32nd Army's fortified line extended from the western shore through Shuri Castle and across the eastern ridges to Yonabaru. Caves and tunnels linked artillery, command posts, and supply chambers. Mortars and machine guns were sited in mutually supporting sectors, often invisible until they opened fire. Every ridge and ravine became part of an interlocking system of observation and withdrawal routes. Japanese doctrine called for limited counterattacks to disrupt advances, then rapid reoccupation of reserve positions once artillery had inflicted casualties. The Japanese Naval Air Arm, meanwhile, initiated the first of 10 major Kikusui attacks, translating to floating chrysanthemums. Beginning April 6th, waves of suicide aircraft, Army and Navy planes loaded with explosives targeted the invasion fleet. Over 350 planes struck that day, sinking or damaging multiple destroyers and transports. One of the most devastating attacks came on April 7th, when the battleship Yamato, the largest in the world, sailed with a small escort to Okinawa on a one-way mission to beach itself and act as a coastal battery. Intercepted by carrier aircraft before reaching its target, it was sunk after repeated bomb and torpedo hits. Nearly 3,000 sailors perished. The destruction of Yamato symbolized Japan's strategic desperation and the narrowing options left to its fleet. While naval engagements raged offshore, on land the campaign transformed into a slow grind. U.S. artillery, supported by naval guns, began a systematic bombardment of the Shuri defenses. Each ridge required days of reconnaissance, followed by coordinated infantry and armor assaults. The Japanese positions, protected by rock and concrete, absorbed massive firepower before giving way. The terrain favored the defenders. Steep slopes, ravines, and concealed reverse faces limited tank maneuvering. Communication lines stretched as engineers repaired roads under fire, and the first heavy rains turned the ground into mud. The southern push toward Shuri marked the transition from the invasion phase to a drawn-out siege that would define the remainder of the battle. By mid-April, both armies had established clear roles, the U.S. force controlling the north and west, the Japanese entrenched in the south. The stage was set for the prolonged contest that would consume the island's landscape, its defenders, and its inhabitants over the next 2 months, a confrontation that would merge air, sea, and land warfare in one of the war's most complex operations. By mid-April 1945, the focus of operations shifted decisively toward the southern third of Okinawa. The U.S. 10th Army prepared for a concentrated assault on the Shuri defensive complex, while continuing to consolidate its northern gains. The Marines had cleared the Motobu Peninsula and captured Mount Yaedake, encountering localized resistance from small groups of infantry entrenched in caves. Farther north, the 77th Infantry Division landed on the outlying island of Ieshima on the 16th of April, where a Japanese garrison of roughly 4,500 men resisted tenaciously from prepared positions. The fighting there lasted 6 days and cost over 1,100 American casualties, including the death of war correspondent Ernie Pyle. With Ieshima secured, its airfield provided an additional base for fighters and transports, completing the ring of airfields surrounding Okinawa. The main struggle now centered on the Shuri Line, an intricate system of fortifications designed to absorb bombardment and draw the attacker into prolonged attrition. Japanese engineers, under the supervision of Colonel Yahara, had transformed the limestone ridges and hills into a continuous network of underground chambers, gun emplacements, and interconnecting tunnels. Artillery was positioned in cave mouths, often with steel shutters that opened only briefly to fire. Infantry bunkers, machine gun nests, and mortar pits were concealed beneath vegetation and rubble. Each position had multiple exits, allowing withdrawal and re-entry from different angles. mines and booby traps covered the approaches. The system's strength lay not in a single fortress, but in depth. As one line fell, the next, only a few hundred meters behind, would engage the attacker again. General Buckner's plan called for 24th Corps to lead the main assault southward, supported by naval and air bombardment of unprecedented scale. Over 27 artillery battalions, including heavy 155mm and 8-inch guns, fired daily barrages that sometimes exceeded 150,000 shells. Offshore, cruisers and battleships conducted rolling barrages, while carrier aircraft struck gun positions and suspected command centers. Yet, despite this firepower, progress remained measured in hundreds of meters. The defenders' positions, largely invisible until engaged, absorbed punishment before reappearing elsewhere. When tanks advanced, they encountered hidden 47mm anti-tank guns, satchel charges, and mines. Infantry squads often had to neutralize each cave individually with flamethrowers, explosives, and hand grenades. Civilian suffering increased dramatically as the front approached populated areas. Many Okinawans had sought refuge in caves, some under coercion by Japanese troops, others voluntarily seeking shelter from bombardment. Food shortages and contaminated water spread disease. The confusion of battle blurred distinctions between combatant and non-combatant as soldiers shared tunnels with families and labor units. American civil affairs officers attempted to establish refugee centers behind the lines, but chaotic movement and language barriers complicated coordination. Reports described families emerging from caves under white flags, while others remained trapped in crossfire or were used by Japanese units to transport supplies. Japanese strategy remained defensive but adaptive. Ushijima and Cho refused early calls from Tokyo to launch large-scale counterattacks, preferring to preserve strength and extend the battle's duration. Yahara's doctrine of attrition aimed to inflict maximum losses and delay American progress, thereby affecting the timing of any future invasion of the home islands. The 32nd Army fielded around 77,000 regular troops, reinforced by 20,000 naval personnel and local auxiliaries. By mid-April, these forces were distributed across 3 defensive zones, anchored on the Uraso-Mura escarpment and the high ground around Shuri Castle. Supply shortages, particularly in ammunition, food, and medical materials, became acute as U.S. artillery destroyed depots and blocked tunnels. Nevertheless, discipline held. Every sector fought until overrun. The naval dimension of the campaign intensified simultaneously. Between 12 April and 29 April, successive Kikusui raids, numbered 2 through 5, brought waves of kamikaze aircraft from Kyushu and Formosa against the Allied fleet. Each attack involved between 150 and 300 aircraft, mixing trained pilots with inexperienced volunteers. Destroyers and radar picket ships bore the brunt, positioned on the perimeter to provide early warning. Damage control teams fought constant fires, while rescue operations retrieved survivors from burning decks. By the end of April, over 20 ships had been sunk and more than 150 damaged. The Japanese air losses were catastrophic, thousands of aircraft destroyed, but each strike forced the fleet to divert resources from direct ground support. Weather compounded the difficulties on both sides. The onset of the rainy season turned fields into quagmires, clogged supply routes, and grounded aircraft. American logistics depended on bulldozed roads and pontoon bridges to move ammunition and rations forward. Medical units contended with malaria, dysentery, and foot infections among the troops. Casualty evacuation required amphibious tractors and jeeps, fitted as ambulances to traverse the mud. Despite these hardships, the 10th Army maintained pressure through rotation of assault divisions. The 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions bore the brunt of initial attacks on the Maeda Escarpment, known to American troops as Sugarloaf Hill, where every meter demanded repeated assaults under constant counterfire. Psychological strain emerged as a decisive factor. Japanese defenders, isolated in cave systems, endured continuous bombardment and loss of communication. Many fought until trapped, resorting to hand-to-hand combat or suicide rather than surrender. American infantrymen faced invisible enemies, sudden explosions, and the challenge of distinguishing genuine surrenders from deceptive attacks. The tempo of operations, with little respite, eroded morale on both sides. Letters and diaries described the campaign as one of endurance rather than maneuver, a slow erasure of positions through exhaustion and firepower. By the end of April, American lines had advanced less than 8 kilometers from their starting point in the south. Shuri Castle remained intact, serving as Ushijima's headquarters. The protracted battle consumed ammunition stocks faster than anticipated, forcing the Navy to ration gunfire support. The Japanese command considered limited counterattacks, but postponed them to coincide with the next Kikusui wave, hoping to coordinate ground and air pressure. For the civilians still trapped between the lines, each bombardment brought new losses, and the caves that had once promised safety now became tombs. As May approached, both armies braced for the next stage, the systematic reduction of the Shuri line itself. The terrain ahead, dominated by ridges, escarpments, and interlocking strongpoints, promised no quick resolution. The struggle for Okinawa, already one of the largest amphibious operations in history, was evolving into a drawn-out siege that would test every resource, decision, and conviction of the commanders who had committed to it. Early May 1945 brought the battle for Okinawa into its most intense phase. After a month of attritional fighting, the U.S. 10th Army prepared for the direct assault on the Shuri line, an operation that demanded both tactical innovation and endurance. General Buckner's forces had encircled the Japanese positions from the west and east, but progress stalled before a succession of formidable ridges. Each feature, Maida Escarpment, Dakshi Ridge, Sugar Loaf, Horseshoe, and Half Moon, became synonymous with ferocious combat, where geography dictated tempo and losses. The Japanese 32nd Army, under Ushijima and Cho, resolved to hold these positions for as long as possible. Knowing each day's delay consumed Allied resources and extended Japan's defensive timeline. The Shuri system combined natural barriers and engineered depth. The Maida Escarpment rose abruptly, its limestone face riddled with bunkers and tunnels. Above it, machine gun and mortar nests covered every approach. American artillery and naval gunfire pounded these defenses continuously, sometimes over 40,000 shells in a single day. But when infantry advanced, concealed positions opened anew. Tanks proved vulnerable to hidden mines and close-range anti-tank fire. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, and napalm became standard tools in reducing each strongpoint. Yet the Japanese soldiers reappeared from secondary exits, forcing repeated engagements over the same ground. The Marines called Sugarloaf Hill the most contested elevation of the campaign, captured, lost, and recaptured multiple times over 2 weeks. As the struggle intensified, command coordination and logistics determined survival. The 1st Marine Division relieved exhausted Army units, while the 6th Marine Division launched converging attacks along the western corridor toward Naha. The 77th Infantry Division advanced from the east, aiming to cut the Shuri defenses in half. Supply lines ran through narrow, muddy roads exposed to sniper fire and intermittent artillery. Engineers operated under constant shelling to maintain bridges and haul ammunition forward. Medical evacuation lagged behind the tempo of combat. Stretcher bearers often worked knee-deep in mud under mortar bursts. The high density of casualties strained field hospitals and hospital ships alike. By mid-May, over 20,000 American soldiers and Marines had been wounded or killed since the landings. Japanese resistance remained cohesive despite the devastation. Ushijima's staff preserved communication through underground telephone lines, enabling coordinated withdrawals between successive positions. Each loss of terrain was deliberate. Defenders retreated only when neighboring units had been annihilated or lines became untenable. The defense's discipline reflected both tactical calculation and fatalistic commitment. Isolated caves continued firing days after their sectors had been bypassed, forcing infantry to clear every pocket. Kamikaze teams launched night sorties against rear areas, and small infiltration parties penetrated American perimeters, causing sporadic panic among supply units. Yet these tactics could not alter the broader imbalance of firepower. Each Japanese regiment, once numbering over 2,000 men, gradually diminished to a few hundred. The air and naval war mirrored this attrition. Between 3 and 29 May, successive Kikasui attacks continued despite mounting losses. Japanese air strength eroded rapidly. By late May, fewer than 1,000 operational aircraft remained across Kyushu and Formosa combined. Still, the suicide missions inflicted damage. Destroyers serving on radar picket duty faced constant assault. Ships such as USS Aaron Ward and USS Brain were heavily damaged or sunk. The cumulative toll on the U.S. fleet reached 36 ships sunk and nearly 400 damaged, with over 4,900 sailors killed and 4,800 wounded during the campaign. Naval anti-aircraft coordination improved through radar-guided fire control, but each attack demonstrated the vulnerability of ships operating close to land-based airfields. For Japan, the expenditure of aircraft and pilots far exceeded replacement capacity. What remained of organized air defense on Kyushu now depended on training schools and emergency conversions of older types. As the Shuri line absorbed bombardment, weather and exhaustion began reshaping command decisions. Torrential rains in mid-May transformed battlefields into rivers of mud, hampering movement and concealment alike. Artillery shells produced geysers instead of craters, and vehicles bogged down across the lowlands. Buckner's staff considered halting major attacks to regroup, but intelligence indicated that Japanese supplies were nearing exhaustion. He ordered continuous pressure, believing attrition would compel withdrawal. In the Japanese headquarters, Colonel Yahara advocated for an organized retreat to secondary lines farther south, preserving what remained of the army for continued resistance. General Cho opposed him, arguing for one last counterattack to restore initiative and preserve morale. Ushijima approved a limited offensive to strike exposed American positions near the eastern sector. On the night of April 5th to May 5th, approximately 7,000 Japanese troops launched the largest counterattack of the Okinawa campaign. Infantry advanced under cover of rain and smoke, supported by mortars and a small number of light tanks. For several hours, they penetrated the forward American lines, reaching artillery positions before being repelled by coordinated fire and naval illumination. The attack collapsed with enormous losses, over 5,000 killed, and the destruction of remaining armored assets. The defeat confirmed Yahara's view that offensive operations were now impossible. Ushijima subsequently ordered a phased withdrawal to the south, abandoning Shuri by late May. When U.S. patrols entered the ruins of Shuri Castle on May 29th, they found tunnels still smoldering from demolition charges. The capture of the strongpoint marked a symbolic victory, but not the end of organized resistance. The Japanese had executed their retreat skillfully, maintaining cohesion despite relentless pressure. The new line centered around the southern coastal ridges near Idamon and Hill 89, where surviving units regrouped to defend the final perimeter. For American troops, this meant beginning anew. Each ridge ahead was another fortified maze, each cave another unseen threat. The campaign's character had shifted from set-piece battles to systematic annihilation of pockets, consuming both manpower and time. Throughout May, the civilian toll escalated beyond military reckoning. Entire villages disappeared under bombardment. Refugees who tried to cross the front risked being shot by either side. Japanese propaganda, warning of atrocities, drove many Okinawans to suicide or to seek shelter among soldiers. American efforts to distribute food and medical aid expanded as lines moved south, yet organization remained limited amid chaos. Civil affairs detachments counted tens of thousands of displaced persons by the end of the month. Disease outbreaks followed destruction of wells and sanitation systems, compounding mortality. By the start of June, the Shuri line had effectively ceased to exist, replaced by fragmented resistance scattered across the island's southern tip. Yet the battle was far from over. Ushijima's army, though reduced to a fraction of its original strength, continued to fight from caves overlooking the sea. Buckner's command planned a final offensive to eradicate the remnants, unaware that the next weeks would exact another severe cost on both armies and on the civilian population that still shared their battlefield. In early June 1945, the Battle of Okinawa entered its terminal stage, but the fighting remained unrelenting. After the fall of the Shuri line, Japanese forces had withdrawn methodically to the island's southern extremity, forming a final defensive perimeter around the rugged hills of Mabuni, Hill 89, and the coastal plateau above Itamen. This area, roughly 10 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide, became a last refuge for the remnants of the 32nd Army, tens of thousands of soldiers, naval troops, and civilians, compressed into a labyrinth of caves and ravines. U.S. reconnaissance estimated fewer than 30,000 defenders remained effective. Japanese records later suggested slightly more, including labor units and medical personnel. Despite their losses, General Ushijima and Chief of Staff Cho refused to surrender. Their intent was to fight until annihilation, to delay the enemy and fulfill their duty to the Emperor as defined by the Imperial General Headquarters. For the U.S. 10th Army, this final phase demanded persistence rather than maneuver. General Buckner reorganized his forces for a concentrated southward drive. The 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions held the central sector. The 1st Marine Division attacked along the west coast toward Itamen. The 6th Marine Division advanced east of them, along the coastal ridges. Artillery from over 700 guns and rocket launchers supported the assault, while naval bombardment resumed with the participation of battleships Tennessee, Idaho, and Missouri. Carrier-based aircraft maintained daily strikes, though bad weather often restricted visibility. Every cave, cliff, and ravine became an objective to be cleared by hand, with infantry supported by flamethrowers, demolition teams, and close air support. The process resembled siege warfare compressed into small terrain cells: attack, seal, bypass, return. Japanese organization in this final phase collapsed into disconnected sectors. Ammunition and food were nearly exhausted. Medical services functioned only in name. Units fought independently, often unaware of neighboring formations. The command staff relocated to caves near Mabuni, operating with field telephones until lines were destroyed. Ushijima's last reserves, students, naval construction workers, and remnants of the 24th Division defended the approaches to Hill 89. In the coastal zone, naval troops established machine gun nests covering potential landing points, anticipating amphibious flanking movements. Yet the American advance came directly from the north, supported by overwhelming artillery. Each ridgeline required days of bombardment, followed by costly assaults. In some sectors, progress was measured in meters per day. Civilian tragedy deepened as the perimeter shrank. Tens of thousands of Okinawans, driven south by combat, found themselves trapped between opposing forces. Many sought shelter in the same caves occupied by Japanese troops, exposing them to artillery fire or executions if they attempted to surrender. Propaganda from Japanese officers and civilian authorities, warning of alleged atrocities, led entire families to commit suicide with grenades or poison. Others perished from starvation or disease. U.S. units encountered growing numbers of civilians emerging under white flags. They were directed to collection points under military supervision. By mid-June, more than 100,000 Okinawans were displaced in refugee camps north of the combat zone, but tens of thousands more remained trapped within it. On the 18th of June, as operations neared completion, General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. was killed by enemy artillery while observing the front near Itamen. He became the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed by enemy fire during the Second World War. Command temporarily passed to Major General Roy Geiger of the Marine Corps, marking the first time a Marine commanded a field army in U.S. history. Geiger estimated that organized resistance would end within days, but he cautioned that isolated pockets could persist for weeks. On 23 June, General Joseph Stilwell arrived to assume overall command, formalizing the last phase of mopping up operations. That same day, the Japanese High Command on Okinawa recognized the inevitability of defeat. Ushijima and Cho conferred with their remaining officers in the Mabuni caves. Colonel Yahara urged surrender to preserve the remaining lives and serve as witnesses to the disaster, but Cho rejected the proposal, insisting on ritual suicide as an example to the nation. Ushijima concurred. Before dawn on 23 June, both men committed seppuku after issuing final orders for surviving troops to continue resistance or take their own lives. Yahara, acting on Ushijima's instruction, survived to provide a record of the battle. The organized Japanese defense effectively ended that morning, though isolated groups fought on for several days in the hills and along the cliffs. For U.S. forces, the conclusion of the campaign did not bring immediate relief. Thousands of Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, continuing to emerge from caves with grenades or concealed weapons. Engineers and infantry had to clear each position systematically. Flamethrowers and explosives sealed entrances to prevent renewed attacks. Mopping up operations lasted into early July, during which sporadic explosions and ambushes continued to cause casualties. By July 2, 1945, General Stilwell declared Okinawa secured, although scattered resistance lingered for weeks. The cost of victory was staggering in material and human terms. The U.S. 10th Army suffered over 49,000 casualties, 12,500 killed or missing, and more than 36,000 wounded. The Navy counted over 4,900 dead and 4,800 wounded from air and surface attacks. Japanese military losses are estimated between 75,000 and 100,000 dead, including those who committed suicide. Civilian casualties remain uncertain, but likely exceeded 100,000, nearly one-quarter of Okinawa's pre-war population. The island's infrastructure was almost entirely destroyed. 90% of buildings flattened, agriculture ruined, and water systems contaminated. The devastation left a landscape of ruins, displaced populations, and vast military cemeteries that testified to the intensity of the campaign. In the weeks following the battle, Okinawa transformed into a forward base for subsequent operations. Engineers repaired the airfields at Kadena and Yontan, expanding runways to accommodate B-29s and transport aircraft. Naval Seabees constructed ports, depots, and hospitals capable of supporting hundreds of thousands of troops. The island became a key logistical node for the planned invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November under Operation Olympic. Yet behind this logistical success lay an unspoken recognition. If resistance on Okinawa had been so fierce, what would an invasion of the Japanese homeland entail? The experience shaped both military planning and political calculations in Washington and Tokyo, where the meaning of the island's destruction began to weigh heavily on the strategies for ending the war. By early July 1945, the guns on Okinawa finally fell silent. The island's population emerged from caves into a landscape of smoke and wreckage. U.S. military government teams began the immense task of reconstruction, disease control, and burial of the dead. The campaign that had begun as a stepping stone to the Japanese mainland had turned into one of the costliest single operations of the Second World War, an event that blurred the line between military victory and human catastrophe, and that would soon influence decisions made far beyond the Pacific battlefield. Sustained combat on Okinawa forced both coalitions to adapt methods, equipment, and organization to conditions that standard doctrine had not fully anticipated. For the U.S. 10th Army, the transition from maneuver to cave-by-cave reduction required specialized tools and combined arms sequences executed with strict timing. Infantry companies paired assault squads with engineers carrying satchel charges, pole charges, Bangalore torpedoes, and flamethrowers. Medium tanks advanced not as breakthrough platforms, but as firing points for canister and high explosive into cave mouths identified by scouts. Self-propelled artillery fired direct at apertures that survived preliminary bombardment. When observation was blocked by smoke or terrain folds, 4.2-inch mortar platoons laid smoke to screen crossings or to force defenders to shift to alternate exits. The sequence repeated at each ridge: locate, suppress, burn out, blast, seal, mark, and bypass, then return to re-clear positions that reactivated at night. Naval and air components revised their own patterns. Radar picket destroyers, stationed 50 to 100 kilometers from the transport area, vectored combat air patrols to intercept inbound raids. Their exposure led to procedural changes. Picket stations gained additional landing craft, with radar sets, LCS gunboats for close-in anti-air, and rescue destroyer escorts to extract crews from damaged ships. Carrier air groups adjusted sortie cycles to keep fighters over the pickets during late afternoon windows, when kamikaze waves commonly arrived from Kyushu. Fighter direction teams experimented with tighter caps of 8 to 12 aircraft per sector. Anti-submarine barriers around Kurama anchored patrol craft, minesweepers, and destroyers to keep explosive boats and midget submarines away from anchorages. Individual ships refined damage control, hose teams pre-rigged, foam nozzles staged, fragment screens over exposed guns to reduce the time from impact to containment. Even with these measures, individual engagements could overwhelm defenses. On 16th April, the destroyer Lafay on a northern picket station fought off more than 20 attackers, was struck multiple times by bombs and aircraft, and remained afloat through rapid counter-flooding and deck fire control until tugs arrived. Japanese adaptation centered on conservation of ammunition, concealment, and psychological pressure. Cave complexes received firing orders that limited bursts to short, pre-measured intervals to prevent Allied observers from fixing exact positions. Mortar teams displaced laterally through tunnels to secondary shafts after each salvo. Heavy weapons, including 150mm guns and spigot mortars of large diameter, were sighted on reverse slopes where naval gunfire could not reach without steep trajectories. Infantry sections rehearsed grenade ambushes and defiles and employed wooden decoys to draw artillery. At night, patrols infiltrated American perimeters to cut telephone lines, plant mines and wheel ruts, and snipe at litter teams and engineers. The aim was not to retake ground, but to increase the cost of each meter and to erode unit cohesion. When positions became untenable, small groups withdrew through pre-surveyed foxholes to tertiary lines, often leaving behind a handful of soldiers to continue firing until overrun. Medical and evacuation systems on both sides reflected the campaign's attritional nature. U.S. battalion aid stations stabilized casualties with plasma and penicillin, then moved them by jeep or litter to collecting points where amphibious tractors shuttled to beach evacuation lanes. From there, LSTs fitted as hospital carriers and dedicated hospital ships evacuated severe cases to floating surgical teams off Kurama or farther rearward to Guam. The volume of wounded required triage protocols that prioritized airway and hemorrhage control to expedite movement from exposed ridgelines. Japanese medical services operated under caves illuminated by lanterns, with limited anesthesia and dwindling dressings. Surgeons reused instruments after boiling water cycles when fuel permitted. Wounded soldiers increasingly remained in positions because movement risked detection. Many died in place when tunnel collapses sealed galleries after bombardments. Civil affairs and psychological operations adjusted to a civilian population that had become intermingled with fighting positions. U.S. leaflet teams refined messages to explain safe conduct procedures and to direct civilians toward marked corridors. Interpreters trained in Okinawan dialects accompanied patrols to negotiate surrenders at cave mouths. Refugee collection points established water purification, rice distribution, and latrine control to limit dysentery. Yet the spread of rumors, some propagated by Japanese officers, others by fear, continued to influence behavior. Many families attempted to reach front lines with white flags. Others remained underground until assault troops were meters away, creating rapid decisions under fire. After incidents in which soldiers misidentified civilians as infiltrators, units adopted stricter challenge procedures and designated lanes guarded by military police for movements to the rear. Intelligence and fire support integration matured as the campaign progressed. Aerial photography teams flew low-altitude runs between rain squalls to revise cave overlays on a daily basis, while artillery observers compiled index cards for each aperture with firing data, bearing, and last seen activity. Corps-level artillery set up time-on-target missions that combined 105mm, 155mm, and 8-inch batteries to strike simultaneously before infantry crossings. Naval gunfire liaison officers maintained radio circuits with cruisers positioned to deliver high-capacity shells against cliff faces. Forward teams adjusted fire by spotting dust plumes from collapsed galleries. When weather-grounded aircraft, radar-directed guns on ships provided counter-battery fire against mortar flashes detected by sound and flash ranging. Organizational rotation functioned as an adaptation to cumulative fatigue. Divisions alternated assault and reserve roles to reconstitute companies, absorb replacements, and integrate lessons learned at regimental schools that replayed specific strong points on sand tables. Instructors emphasized grenade arcs, flamethrower hose protection, and coordinated use of smoke on confined approaches. Armor crews practiced reverse slope hull-down firing to reduce exposure to close attack teams. Engineers standardized explosive loads for sealing tunnels, then marked sealed caves with coated paint to prevent accidental re-entry by subsequent units. Japanese command at Mabuni revised communications to cope with severed landlines. Runners carried sketch maps showing relief positions and ammunition caches. Messages were written in block characters to be legible under dim light. With radio silence relaxed in late stages, short transmissions coordinated final resupply from coastal caches landed by small craft at night. When heavy rain flooded galleries, defenders moved munitions to upper chambers and converted lower tunnels into sump pits. As food ran out, commanders prioritized cartridges and hand grenades over rations, betting that hunger would matter less than the need to fire during final assaults. The naval campaign's adaptation cycle closed with layered defenses that combined pickets, combat air patrols, and barrage balloons over anchorages to disrupt shallow-angle dives. The cumulative effect reduced successful strikes but did not eliminate losses. On days when multiple waves approached from different bearings, sector controllers split fighters into altitude tiers to catch high-speed approaches and low-level sea skimmers. When raids slipped through, proximity-fused shells from 5-inch guns detonated near targets and damaged multiple aircraft in tight formations, an effect particularly noted against groups using valley approaches on Okinawa's west side. Material sustainment under fire required constant improvisation. Seabees carved switchbacks into ridges to move ammunition forward with tractors. When roads failed, cargo nets and block and tackle rigs hauled boxes by hand. Water points moved repeatedly as shelling contaminated wells. Quartermasters issued rubber boots and emphasized foot care. Infantry companies mandated sock changes and foot powder, a daily stand-to. Artillery units rotated barrels after sustained firing to preserve accuracy. Forward observers tracked drift corrections for guns that could not afford downtime. By late June, these patterns of resistance and adaptation had produced cumulative effects measurable in reduced sortie success offshore and incremental gains ashore. The Japanese ability to inflict losses remained, but the frequency and coherence of their countermeasures declined as ammunition and communications failed. American assaults, while costly, benefited from refined drill and tighter integration of fires. For civilians, adaptations meant survival for some and continued peril for others, depending on proximity to caves, access to corridors, and the timing of withdrawals. The peak intensity of the campaign thus expressed itself less in a single climactic clash than in the convergence of many small adjustments that, together, determined how the last ridges would fall and how many would live to see the fighting end. Resistance evolved across multiple layers, command, unit, and household, shaped by dwindling resources and a battlefield whose geometry reduced options to endurance and incremental advantage. In the South, the 32nd Army reorganized fragments into ad hoc battalions with clear rules: conserve cartridges, avoid silhouette exposure, and force attackers to expend engineering stores at every cave. Platoons positioned lookouts with range boards scratched on tin so that short bursts could be fired at pre-measured distances, without revealing the gun's exact aperture. Mortar crews shifted after 2 salvos through side galleries marked by string lines to prevent disorientation and smoke. When communications failed, runners followed chalk arrows on tunnel walls toward alternate command posts dug into reverse slopes. Where rifles became scarce, defenders rotated men to positions with serviceable weapons, allotting a fixed number of rounds per hour. This was resistance as administered scarcity. American formations countered with drill rather than speed. Assault companies paired engineers and infantry in fixed teams, each with a defined task and hand signals to compensate for blast noise and limited visibility in defiles. Flame and demolition sections were no longer exceptional attachments, but routine. 2 flamethrowers per platoon in the lead. Demolition men carrying 10 to 20 kilogram satchel charges on rope slings. Riflemen pacing their advance to match the burn and seal cycle. Tank dozer attachments carved firing bays where medium tanks could sit hull down to rake apertures, while bulldozer blades pushed spoil to form cover. Where ridge lines made tanks untenable, 75mm pack howitzers were manhandled forward and fired at near point-blank range. The cycle, smoke, suppress, flame, breach, clear, seal, repeated ridge after ridge. Logistics became a contest of friction. U.S. beach groups shifted supply from open sand to pierced steel planking lanes, moving ammunition at night to reduce exposure to harassing fire. When rain made tracks impassable, Seabees rigged block and tackle lifts up cut banks, hauling box by box to forward dumps. Engineer water points relocated daily as shell bursts contaminated cisterns. Maintenance companies cannibalized wrecked vehicles to keep a fraction running. Tank battalions rotated tubes and road wheels to extend fleet life under constant rock chips and mud. Japanese supply moved by hand at night. Rice in cloth sacks, grenades in woven baskets, machine gun belts in bundles lashed with hemp. Coastal caches were landed by small craft when seas permitted, then carried inland along footpaths under strict light discipline. Where no ammunition could be delivered, units reconfigured to grenade traps and close-in ambushes intended to produce psychological effect disproportionate to the rounds expended. Air and naval components adapted their roles to the rhythm on shore. Carrier strikes shifted from interdiction to scheduled on-call missions tied to ground time blocks. Air liaison officers sat in regimental command posts, plotting pre-planned target boxes for aircraft to hit within minutes of request. Destroyers on radar picket duty formed composite nodes with gunboats and landing craft, mounting additional radar to increase early warning range. When kamikaze raids arrived from multiple bearings, fighter direction split combat air patrols into altitude tiers to intercept both dives and sea-skimming approaches. Proximity-fused 5-inch shells detonated near densely packed attackers and degraded formations before they reached the transports. Damage control evolved into rehearsed ritual. Hose teams pre-rigged, foam staged, electrical panels shielded, cutting minutes from response time after each impact. Intelligence worked through accumulation rather than revelation. Low-level photographers mapped cave apertures and trench cuts at scales that let forward observers index each position on pocket cards. Sound and flash ranging triangulated mortar sites. Artillery then used time-on-target missions that combined 105mm, 155mm, and 8-inch fire to collapse galleries before infantry closed. Prisoner interrogations, initially rare, grew more frequent in June as small groups surrendered when ammunition failed or when trapped behind new American lines. Interpreters learned cues to distinguish civilians from soldiers in work clothes. Surrenders increased where safe conduct leaflets had circulated for several days, and where units established predictable corridors with visible markers and loudspeaker instructions. Medical systems adapted to attrition. Battalion aid stations triaged to hemorrhage and airway control, pushing morphine and plasma forward and leaving splinting and definitive care for collecting stations. Amphibious tractors ferried casualties to evacuation lanes delineated by engineer tape, then to LSTs outfitted as hospital ships. Surgical teams standardized procedures for cave blast trauma. Ear, eye, burn, and penetrating fragment injuries predominated. Japanese surgeons, short on anesthesia and sterilization fuel, worked by lantern light. As galleries flooded in the rains, lower tunnels were abandoned and converted to sumps, concentrating treatment in cramped upper chambers. Mortality rose with each collapse that sealed groups beyond reach of excavation. Morale management became an operational function. U.S. divisions rotated battalions from assault to reserve to rehearse reduction techniques on sand table replicas of known strong points, absorb replacements, and sleep under tents instead of caves. Mail and hot rations were treated as planned events. Units installed foot care protocols to limit trench foot, that would otherwise remove riflemen from the line. Chaplains and burial details operated near the front, standardizing field services and identification to prevent backlogs. Japanese command, in contrast, relied on discipline, indoctrination, and peer enforcement as rations dwindled. Orders emphasized silence, husbanding of ammunition, and use of local terrain features memorized during rehearsals. Where surrender became thinkable for isolated groups, coercion and threat of reprisals often held men in position. By mid-June, however, incidents increased in which small parties laid down weapons when approached by interpreters with promises of food and medical care. Civilian adaptation intersected with both militaries' procedures. Families who had moved south with the retreat found themselves compressed into zones where caves served simultaneously as shelters, aid posts, and firing points. Student nurse formations, organized months earlier, now worked alongside Army medics in tunnel hospitals, dressing wounds and evacuating patients under bombardment. U.S. civil affairs teams refined the architecture of refugee camps north of the fighting. Water points, latrines, ration schedules, and guarded lanes for new arrivals. Identification cards recorded village and family units to ease reunions and reduce rumors. Even so, the proximity of war to households produced ambiguous moments. White flags at cave mouths where soldiers and civilians emerged together. Sudden grenades thrown by men who had concealed weapons to avoid dishonor. Mistaken fire when infiltrators used civilian movement to mask approach. Procedures tightened. Challenge and password, fixed hours for crossings, distinct markers for refugee columns separate from supply convoys. Doctrine on both sides bent without breaking. American command resisted large envelopments that terrain could not support, accepting a measured grind that kept units coordinated with artillery and naval fire. Japanese command abandoned counterattacks after early May and concentrated on defense in depth, seeking to make each approach a problem in geometry and explosives rather than maneuver. Weather set outer limits. In heavy rain, both armies shifted to maintenance, drainage, and localized probes, then resumed the reduction cycle once visibility returned. Neither side achieved a sudden advantage. Instead, the sum of adjustments, procedural, technical, psychological, gradually eroded the defenders' capacity to impose losses while preserving their own strength. By the third week of June, signs of culmination appeared in quantifiable ways. Kamikaze raids still launched, but with fewer aircraft per wave and longer intervals. Mortar fire from the Japanese side became sporadic as tubes cracked and stocks ran out. American support cycles shortened from hours to minutes as radio nets, air liaison, and artillery fire plans reached a tempo that cave garrisons could not match. Refugee flows increased through established corridors, and prisoner counts rose daily. The campaign's resistance and adaptation phase had not produced a decisive maneuver. It had produced conditions, exhaustion, depletion, and procedural superiority that made the final ridges south of Mabuni less a fortress than a series of isolated positions waiting to be sealed. A turning point emerged in late May and June 1945, not as a single dramatic breakthrough, but as a convergence of tactical attrition, command decisions, and altered strategic expectations in both capitals. On Okinawa, the evacuation of Shuri and the shift of Japanese forces to the Mabuni pocket signaled that the defensive concept of trading space for time had reached its limit. The 32nd Army no longer shaped the battle's tempo, but reacted to it. Offshore, the Kikasui sequence thinned. Early April waves had launched more than 300 aircraft in a day. By mid to late June, raid sizes fell below 100 and intervals lengthened as training fields on Kyushu and Formosa emptied. Radar pickets still suffered, but interception rates rose and successful penetrations dwindled. Changing fleet commanders risked calculus from immediate survival to sustainment for weeks. These operational inflections were visible in the data. Fewer large-scale air contacts, reduced mortar density ashore, and rising daily counts of civilians and small groups of soldiers surrendering through marked corridors. In Washington, planners translated battlefield outcomes into forecasts for the next phase. The Joint War Plans Committee on June 15th reviewed casualty experience on Okinawa and revised projections for Operation Olympic. the invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November. Their estimate for the first 90 days called for roughly 130,000 U.S. Army casualties, including about 25,000 dead, with Navy losses assessed separately due to kamikaze exposure. General MacArthur's staff circulated a lower figure for the first 4 months, near 105,000 total casualties, predicated on rapid consolidation of airfields. Naval planners, citing Okinawa's picket ship data, argued that fleet losses could be disproportionate if Kyushu's shore-based aviation matched early Kikusui intensity. Medical services calculated bed requirements in the Central Pacific and on Okinawa itself, projecting tens of thousands of evacuees per month if Olympic proceeded. The numbers varied, but all drew on the same turning point inference from Okinawa. An invasion of the home islands would be a protracted attritional operation, with combined land-sea-air casualties exceeding those of any previous Pacific campaign. Tokyo's response moved in the opposite direction, toward concentration. Keitsugo, the defense of the home islands, prioritized Kyushu as the decisive battlefield. By June, the Imperial General Headquarters planned to mass over 10 field divisions there, reinforced by mixed brigades, coastal defense units, and air formations assembled from training commands. The Volunteer Fighting Corps mobilized men aged 15 to 60 and women 17 to 40 for local service. Armament inventories showed critical shortages, with many units allocated spears, hunting guns, or limited rifles. The air component expected to organize several thousand aircraft for special attack, including training types adapted as explosive carriers. Okinawa's attrition persuaded Tokyo that preserving aircraft for the moment of invasion mattered more than sustaining daily sorties now. The turning point thus meant conserving resources for Kyushu rather than contesting Okinawa's outcome, which was already judged irreversible. Operationally, the 10th Army's procedures confirmed that the initiative had passed irretrievably. Artillery time on target fires collapsed galleries in minutes instead of hours. Air liaison cells placed pre-planned target boxes over the last ridge lines and cleared them with strike fires in predictable cycles. Engineers standardized charges for sealing tunnels and recorded them in regimental tables, reducing improvisation. Prisoner interrogation teams, initially rare, processed dozens daily by mid-June, producing sketch maps of tertiary positions that shortened reconnaissance time. The tempo compressed. Requests to counter battery, illumination, and smoke could be met within minutes. The defenders' bandwidth, once sufficient to reposition mortars and machine guns between salvos, no longer matched the pace of American fire control. For the fleet, the transition was equally measurable. Combat air patrols, once spread thin across multiple picket lines, reorganized into altitude tiers and sectors with dedicated fighter direction teams. Proximity-fused 5-inch fire disrupted close-formed raiders before they reached the inner screen. Hospital ships and repair tenders at Karama rotated damaged destroyers through standardized yard periods measured in days, not weeks, restoring radar coverage quickly enough that gaps no longer coincided with peak raid hours. The statistical shape of risk changed. Individual ships could still be lost, but systemic collapse of the screen became less likely. This permitted continuous naval gunfire against the southern ridges and steadier logistics to the beaches, reinforcing the land campaign's momentum. Civilian flows mirrored the shift. As corridors stabilized and interpreters repeated instructions at fixed hours, the rate of surrenders rose. Field hospitals designated wards for non-combatants and established triage separate from military lines to reduce accidental mixing with infiltrators. Refugee camps north of the front reached 6 figures by late June, and water purification output expanded accordingly. These measures did not eliminate tragedy, but they indicated that the battle's geometry now favored controlled movement away from the front rather than chaotic flight through it. Each column that passed through an MP checkpoint represented fewer potential auxiliaries for the caves and more witnesses to the island's devastation. Command signals framed the turning point in human terms. On the 18th of June, General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. was killed by artillery while forward with observers. The field army passed briefly to Lieutenant General Roy Geiger, and then to General Joseph Stilwell. The succession was immediate and orderly, operations continued with existing fires plans, indicating institutional resilience under shock. In the Mabuni Caves, conversely, Ushijima and Cho faced an inverse calculation. The failed counterattack of April 5th to May 5th had expended irreplaceable infantry and armor. Ammunition and rations no longer supported coordinated action. Colonel Yahara urged preservation of witnesses through surrender, but on June 23rd, Ushijima and Cho chose suicide after issuing orders that left only scattered resistance. The absence of a negotiated ceasefire and the persistence of isolated fighting into early July showed both the systemic collapse of the defense and its residual fragmentation. Strategic leverage followed quickly. With Kadena, Yantan, and Ieshima in American hands, fighter and transport traffic expanded. P-47s and P-51s staged through to escort B-29s. P-61s, night fighters patrolled against intruders, and photo reconnaissance flights mapped Kyushu's coastal defenses in preparation for Olympic. Seabees accelerated depot and hospital construction, targeting capacities to support several 100,000 troops. Submarines and mine layers operating from Okinawan anchorages tightened the maritime blockade. The island's air and sea network linked directly to the broader campaign against Japan's economy and infrastructure, making Okinawa not just an objective, but an active instrument for operations beyond it. The turning point's significance, therefore, lay in three linked outcomes. First, the tactical. Organized Japanese resistance lost the ability to dictate tempo, while U.S. combined arms reached a reproducible method for reducing each remaining position. Second, the operational. The fleet's air defense and damage control systems matured to sustain weeks of continuous support despite ongoing losses. Third, the strategic. Both governments recalculated the cost and probability of success for the next decision. Tokyo concentrated for a decisive home island battle, and Washington weighed invasion, blockade, and intensified bombing with new casualty tables derived from Okinawa. The island had ceased to be a contested stepping stone, and had become a platform from which the final choices of the Pacific War would be made. By early July 1945, organized resistance on Okinawa had effectively ceased, though isolated pockets persisted in the island's southern tip and interior ravines. The process of transition from combat to occupation was neither instantaneous nor orderly. U.S. patrols still faced ambushes in the hills south of Mabuni and along the cliffs near Iketeman, where individual Japanese soldiers or small groups chose suicide over surrender. Mine clearance teams advanced cautiously through fields littered with unexploded ordnance, collapsed caves, and the remains of fortifications. Navy divers removed scuttled suicide boats from coastal shallows, while engineers began surveying roads and bridges for repair. Yet the principal task before the 10th Army and the U.S. military government was humanitarian, stabilizing a shattered civilian population of more than 300,000 survivors amid destruction that had erased nearly every structure on the island. The immediate aftermath was defined by relief operations and burial details. Graves registration units recorded over 110,000 Japanese dead by the end of July, interring them in mass sites near former battlefields. American casualties required similar attention. 12,500 dead and more than 36,000 wounded were processed through field hospitals and evacuation points. Disease prevention became urgent. Rain and decomposing bodies contaminated wells, producing outbreaks of dysentery and malaria. Medical detachments distributed quinine and disinfectants, while engineers installed temporary water filtration plants along the west coast. The same amphibious tractors that had carried troops to the beaches now ferried rice, medicine, and clothing to civilian camps. Within a month, a rudimentary logistics network for humanitarian aid paralleled the one built for combat. The military government established its headquarters at Shuri, among the ruins of the castle that had served as the Japanese command post. The structure, devastated by artillery and naval fire, symbolized the scale of destruction across Okinawa. Administration was divided into functional sections: public health, food distribution, housing, police, and education. Interpreters recruited from Okinawan survivors mediated between American officers and local headmen. The priority was to restore order without reinstating wartime authorities. Weapons confiscation and registration of returning civilians occupied the first weeks. Demobilized Okinawans, many of whom had been pressed into labor or local defense units, returned to farming under supervision, using salvage tools and seed stocks from military supplies. Civil affairs reports described an initial atmosphere of shock rather than hostility. Most survivors sought food and medical aid, not confrontation. The Japanese military remnants presented a complex problem. Hundreds of soldiers remained hidden in caves, unwilling to surrender despite leaflets and loudspeaker appeals. Some emerged months later, driven by hunger. Others were discovered in 1946. Those captured were processed through interrogation centers for intelligence on Kyushu defenses and the morale of the home islands. Officers questioned survivors like Colonel Yahara, whose detailed recollection of the battle later became a primary source for historians. These interrogations confirmed what American planners already suspected. The ferocity of Okinawa's defense was not the product of irrational resistance alone, but of a deliberate strategy to maximize Allied casualties and delay the invasion of Japan itself. Strategically, Okinawa's capture transformed Allied logistics across the Western Pacific. The island's position, roughly equidistant between the Philippines, Formosa, and Kyushu, allowed direct projection of air and sea power against the Japanese homeland. Within weeks, Kadena and Yontan airfields hosted fighter groups, reconnaissance squadrons, and transport wings. Engineers expanded runways to handle B-29 superfortresses, while Ie-shima became a key base for transport and communications. Naval facilities at Nakagusuku Bay, later Buckner Bay, evolved into a deep-water anchorage for hundreds of vessels, complete with floating docks, repair ships, and fuel depots. The massive infrastructure effort, undertaken even as the island smoldered, anticipated the logistical demands of Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Kyushu in November 1945. However, the psychological and political implications of Okinawa's devastation reached beyond logistics. Reports from the island's hospitals and cemeteries circulated through Washington and London, shaping discussions about invasion alternatives. The ratio of American casualties to Japanese defenders, the endurance of kamikaze attacks, and the extent of civilian suffering all reinforced doubts about the feasibility of invading Japan without catastrophic loss. President Truman's advisors, including Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General George Marshall, used Okinawa's data in memoranda assessing potential casualties for the home island operations. Their estimates range from several 100,000 to over 1 million total Allied casualties, depending on assumptions of Japanese resistance similar to or greater than Okinawa's. These projections coincided with the Manhattan Project's nearing completion, giving the atomic option new strategic weight. In Tokyo, Okinawa's fall produced both shock and fatalism. Imperial headquarters officially acknowledged the loss only in July, weeks after Ushijima's death. Propaganda framed the defeat as a delay operation that had succeeded in drawing the enemy closer to Japan and exposing him to attrition. In reality, Okinawa's destruction underscored the vulnerability of the home islands to blockade and bombardment. Industrial production was collapsing, transport networks were fragmenting under air attack, and fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Yet the defeat did not immediately trigger surrender. Instead, it reinforced the rationale for Ketsugo, the belief that inflicting heavy losses on the invaders during an attempted landing could force a negotiated peace. To many within the Imperial Army, Okinawa demonstrated both the potential and the price of that strategy. For Okinawan civilians, the post-battle months blended survival with displacement. Thousands were relocated to temporary camps near Kadena, where prefabricated huts replaced destroyed villages. Food distribution depended on American supply ships until local agriculture recovered. Schools reopened under military supervision, teaching basic literacy and hygiene while avoiding political instruction. Despite hardship, civil order stabilized faster than expected. Theft and violence remained limited, largely due to strict enforcement by the military police and the visible presence of aid distribution. In diaries collected later, survivors recalled the paradox of being liberated from one military regime into the administration of another, both foreign, both determining every aspect of daily existence. Cultural and ecological consequences followed the material ruin. Forests stripped for fortifications left soil erosion that turned fields to clay during rain. Sacred sites and family tombs had been used as defensive positions or destroyed by bombardment, complicating post-war rituals. Entire family registers vanished. Villages were rebuilt on altered terrain, dictated by new road grids and military installations. The line between occupation and reconstruction blurred as Okinawa transitioned into a vast logistical complex rather than a restored province. By August, the island functioned as an American stronghold, simultaneously a cemetery and a base, its population living among the wreckage of what had been both their homeland and the last battlefield before Japan itself. The aftermath therefore stood as an ambiguous conclusion, militarily decisive, humanitarianly catastrophic, and politically transitional. Okinawa had been taken, but at such cost that its capture redefined the meaning of victory in the Pacific. Its ruined hills and overcrowded camps provided both a warning and a precedent, a glimpse of what an invasion of Japan might look like, and a material foundation from which that invasion could be launched if chosen. In the coming weeks, that choice would shift from generals to politicians, as new weapons and new calculations emerged to determine how the war would finally end. The legacy of Okinawa unfolded across military practice, political decision-making, and civilian life long after combat ended. At the operational level, the campaign validated a method of joint, sequential reduction against fortified terrain. Naval gunfire to strip vegetation and collapse cliff faces. Artillery time-on-target missions to suppress cave mouths. Infantry engineer teams with flamethrowers and demolitions to seal galleries. Armor or direct-fire artillery to neutralize positions that survive bombardment. Fire support coordination centers that synchronized ships, aircraft, and core artillery became templates for later doctrine. Radar picket experience drove procurement and training priorities, layered fighter direction, standardized damage control drills, and widespread adoption of proximity-fuse 5-inch ammunition. Medical evacuation chains from Ridge to LST Hospital configured post-war amphibious planning. These lessons did not guarantee low casualties, but they created a reproducible framework for assaults against complex defenses. For the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces, Okinawa marked the endpoint of a defensive strategy predicated on attrition and sacrifice. The 32nd Army showed that cave networks, reverse slope positions, and economy of ammunition could delay a superior enemy for months and inflict thousands of casualties. Yet the approach consumed irreplaceable personnel and materiel at a rate the home islands could not sustain. Kikusui raids demonstrated that coordinated special attack sorties could sink and damage dozens of ships, but the cost in aircraft and pilots exceeded Japan's training pipeline and fuel supply. The loss of Yamato and escorts and the depletion of shore-based aviation ended the possibility of decisive fleet action near Kyushu. Lessons developed at Okinawa, concealment, fire discipline, dispersed command, were incorporated into Kitsugo planning, but the armistice prevented their application on Kyushu. Politically, Okinawa influenced decisions in Washington and Tokyo during June to August 1945. U.S. planners revised casualty projections for an invasion of Kyushu using Okinawa's data. Daily rates from cave reduction, naval losses under land-based air attack, and the ratio of wounded to killed across Army, Marine, and Navy components. Estimates varied by staff and assumption, but reached six-figure totals for the first months of Operation Olympic. These assessments intersected with the approaching availability of atomic bombs and the tightening maritime blockade. In Tokyo, Okinawa's fall encouraged hardliners to double down on Ketsugo, arguing that concentrated casualties on Kyushu could force a negotiated settlement. The same event strengthened the argument among Japanese officials seeking an end to the war that continued resistance would devastate civilian populations without altering outcomes. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August and the Soviet entry into the war, the cabinet accepted the emperor's decision to surrender. The calculus behind that decision included, among other factors, the attrition and civilian destruction witnessed on Okinawa. The island's post-war trajectory linked occupation to geopolitics. In 1952, the San Francisco Peace Treaty restored Japanese sovereignty on the main islands, but placed the Ryukyus under U.S. administration. Military government evolved into the U.S. civil administration of the Ryukyu Islands, while large bases, Kadena Air Base, Futenma, and a network of Marine and Army installations expanded over former battlefields. Strategic logic during the Cold War positioned Okinawa as a logistics and strike hub for Korea and later Vietnam. Reversion to Japan in 1972 transferred civil administration while leaving substantial U.S. facilities in place under the Security Treaty framework. The base presence brought employment and infrastructure, but also ongoing negotiations over land use, noise, and accidents. Issues rooted in the island's wartime transformation into a garrison. Commemoration on Okinawa took shape around names and sites rather than victory monuments. June 23rd became a prefectural day of remembrance, Ire no. The Peace Memorial Park at Mabuni and the Cornerstone of Peace list the dead of all nationalities who perished in the campaign, recording more than 200,000 names as research has expanded. School curricula, museums, and survivor testimonies emphasize the civilian experience, displacement, cave shelters, forced labor, and the collapse of social structures under bombardment, alongside military operations. For many residents, the battle's legacy is less a narrative of tactical episodes than a map of erased villages, altered coastlines, and family registers broken by death or missing persons. Historiography remains active on several questions. Analysts debate the counterfactual costs of Olympic using different baselines. Okinawa's rates extrapolated to Kyushu's larger scale, expected Japanese aircraft inventories and fuel, the effect of Soviet entry, and the role of atomic weapons in compelling surrender. Other debates examine command choices, Buckner's adherence to a methodical southward drive versus alternatives such as large-scale end runs or broader amphibious envelopments. Ushijima's acceptance of Yahara's attritional scheme over repeated counterattacks. The timing and targets of Kikusui waves. Civilian casualty totals vary by method, military reports, post-war surveys, and memorial registries, yielding ranges that underscore the difficulty of quantifying deaths from hunger, disease, and suicide amid shattered administration. Technically, Okinawa accelerated changes that defined post-war forces. Fleet air defense evolved from ad hoc pickets to integrated systems combining radar, fighter direction, and missiles in later decades. Amphibious doctrine retained the sequence of ship-to-shore movement, naval gunfire, and engineer-led breach, but placed greater weight on civil affairs, public health, and the management of large displaced populations. Air-ground coordination practices at regimental and divisional levels informed close air support procedures in Korea. On land, the campaign highlighted requirements for flamethrowers, demolition charges, and specialized armor for fortified terrain, while also exposing their limits when terrain and weather constrained observation and movement. The campaign's human costs continue to frame its significance. The U.S. 10th Army recorded more than 49,000 casualties ashore. The Navy counted thousands killed and wounded from air and surface action. Japanese military dead exceeded 75,000. Civilian deaths likely surpassed 100,000. These totals place Okinawa among the Pacific War's most lethal operations. The figures also reveal asymmetries. Naval losses concentrated in picket screens far from beaches. Infantry attrition driven by cave reduction. Civilian mortality clustered during the final weeks when front lines compressed around the South. The distribution of loss shaped memory differently in each society. Service branch histories in the United States, institutional self-assessment in Japan, and community-level remembrance in Okinawa. In sum, Okinawa's legacy is threefold. Militarily, it produced codified practices for joint assault against fortified terrain and demonstrated both the potential and limits of special attack tactics against modern fleets. Politically, it informed final phase decisions by quantifying the costs of invasion and by demonstrating the interaction among blockade, bombardment, and civilian collapse. Socially and culturally, it left a dense landscape of remembrance that continues to mediate relations among Okinawa, Tokyo, and Washington. The island that served as the last major battlefield of the Pacific War remains, in memory and infrastructure, a place where the conduct of war and the conditions of peace are examined side by side.